All right, Molo Sembonani, hello, how's it? Good evening, dear folks. Apologies for that 2 or 3 minute late start. We just had to work out a few bugs in the system. Good evening, welcome to it. My name is Sikhle Ngobese, aka Big Daddy Liberty. This is Liberty and Friends, which comes to you every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. It is the one long format show that I have. We're usually with you for about 90 minutes or so as we break down the news week that was. It has been a while since I've seen you. Goodness me, I've been rather under the weather and sick for the past 2 weeks. That spicy cough, man, it had me, it had me by the twig and berries, if I can put that in a more respectable way. Speaking about respectable, this evening is just filled with a need for regal decorum, if you will, insofar as the main topic tonight will be looking at the life and times and really the death, if you will, of Queen Elizabeth II. Now, we'll get into that in about, let's call it 30 minutes or so, or maybe less, as as we always do on the show. We look at the news week that was. What are some of the items that made headlines in the week that got you talking? Angry maybe, or sad or happy, whatever the case may be. Tonight I'll be joined with the Friends panel who will help me unpack all of those issues. Now, before I introduce the Friends panel, as always on the show, guys, do me a solid favor. Hit that like button. It really does help get the show out to a wider audience. It does something with the social media algorithms, and of course, share the stream. So, with that being said, good evening, welcome to it. It's very interesting to see where everybody's saying they're from. I even saw a St. Lucia in the comment section. I'm looking forward to being in St. Lucia at some stage this month. It's my birthday month, people. So hopefully I'll spend my birthday on the 26th in that part of the world. Speaking about my birthday, as a final reminder to you guys, you can support this channel financially. Remember, we've got a website. That's www.bigdaddyliberty.com. And at the bottom of that website, you can find out how you can support the show on a monthly basis. Guys, anything as little as 100 Rand a month is more than enough to actually get us going. Help me hire the editors. And as my dream is to get some actual journalists, some correspondents to do some freelance work for us on the show as we transition towards generating hard news and not just the analysis of it. Right. Well, with that jibber jabber out of the way, and as I clear that last vestige of the spicy cough, let me get my friends panel on the screen. He is 1/3 of that wonderful Poiki Pots that we call the Manpatria podcast. Did you see their latest episode on Saturday? Make sure you catch them, please, and also visit them on their websites at manpatria.com. I'm talking, of course, about Koketso Resane. Good evening.
Yeah, evening, Sitle. Good to be back on Liberty and Friends. I feel like it's been a while. We are correcting that now.
Absolutely. It has been an insane while. And I've definitely missed the show and missed you guys. With that being said, welcome to it, Koketso. As I said, Koketso, of course, is 1/3 of the hosts at the Manpatria podcast. Please check them out, subscribe to their channel, and let's start growing alternative media in this country. Speaking about someone who is growing media, and someone who has a lot of experience in that regard, Kanthan Pillay. Baba, good evening.
And shalom, guys. Good to see you.
Shalom, my brother. Very good to have you on the show as always. Kanthan, by the way, has a blog that he contributes to. I think I'm still holding him to the standard of daily. Kanthan, I'm not sure if you're still holding on to that.
I'm afraid the daily thing kind of dropped out about probably about 6 weeks ago. Updated infrequently these days. I must say that having kept up the challenge of writing on a daily basis for more than 100 days, I decided at that point, well, I've shown that I can do this, and let's move on.
But I was about to say it is not easy, and also testament to how long it's been, 6 weeks. since perhaps more since we've last spoken on the show. Let me just introduce my last guest here. Actually, not my last guest, my second to last guest, Herman Pretorius, who of course is the director at the FAN Group. That's the Freedom Advocacy Network, doing great work advocating for freedom. Herman, Baba, good evening.
Good evening. You know what they say, always leave the best to second to last.
Well, with that being said, Herman, very good to have you. There is one more guest. I'm just struggling to get a hold of him. He's new to the show, but someone who I think will add great flavor if we manage to get him on the show. Maqhawe Ngubane, aka Ishumlenkezo. And he is, of course, a isiZulu language practitioner and someone who I was hoping would complete my my 4 guest panel. Sorry, I got trapped on my own sentence construction there. I was planning to have 4 guests. Let me simplify that. And each of whom belong to a particular cultural grouping in this country, all of whom who have an experience, historically speaking, with colonialism and really the English influence on our society as South Africans. As I said, that main topic for this evening will look at the life and times of the Queen, and with her death, ask certain, or rather ask broader questions around the influence, the effects, the good, the bad, and the ugly, if you will, of English colonial rule and really the crown, its effects, pardon me, on South Africans. But before we get into that mainstay of a conversation, guys, let's look at the week that was with some of the topics that were covered also on Vuganazo, our new weekday morning analysis show here on the BDL show. I hope you guys are enjoying that show. And one of the issues we looked at this week is one which I found rather disgusting. And maybe let me begin here. The goat rapist, or the bestiality man, I don't know how to finish that sentence either, who was caught by the community of Mqhuze, which is north, hang on, is it Mqhuze? I just might have gotten that wrong for a moment. You know you're a South African when you Google search goat rapist KZN. All right, as that loads up, as I remind myself,
You're on some
as to
watch
where
list
exactly.
somewhere now.
Pardon me, that's Mtunzini. There's a Mtunzini on the north coast of KZN. Ordinarily a sleepy hollow, Kanthan, but a community rocked by what was effectively them stumbling on this man in the act of raping a goat. Now, here's where it gets much more darker, if you will. His plan, insofar as what he tried to do, was to transition from the goat and then rape the owner of the goat, a elderly woman who was alone at the time. And a community who decided to heck with bringing law enforcement, we'll take the law into our own hands and beat this man to death. What a ordinary, pardon me, what an awkward set of multiple moving parts that make for a lugubrious story.
You're seriously asking us to comment on the sheer indignity of a person wanting to inflict himself upon a goat? Sihle, really, this is...
I'll tell you what I really want us to chew on for a moment. For me, the interesting part was the community's response. They had no intention, effectively, of waiting for the police and law enforcement and obviously the rule of law to take its place on this issue. They felt a desperation to actually murder this man themselves by way of mob justice. And for me, this is what the takeaway was. It speaks to an overall sentiment in this country, a frustration with law enforcement.
You're absolutely spot on, and that's something that we've been noticing for quite a while. And fundamentally what it comes down to is the failure of the systems that were put in place over generations to actually provide even a modicum of justice for the people of this country. One really can't end up having a sense of disdain for these people, because if the systems were actually working, one would actually expect that things would be in place that would ensure that these atrocities would not be committed on a day-to-day basis. But we do have these atrocities committed on a day-to-day basis. And when crime becomes the norm, one can actually expect people to end up defying the law and ending up taking it into their own hands. But I'm still deeply disturbed by this image of the goat, Sishle. You've actually thrown me a bit of a curveball there. I'm going to need a sip of wine to deal with that.
Trust you me, I had the same difficulty this week in even relaying the story on Voganazo, the daily morning show that we have, because for me there were so many moving parts to the story, Herman, which again speak to two major violations. The one, of course, is, and Kanthan is spot on in raising the specter of this becoming a nationwide problem. By the way, it's not just isolated to, what happened in Mthunzini in this particular incident. One can cite many incidents of mob justice. I'm sorry, I'm feeling a little ill. Mob justice incidents where people are, as I said, are frustrated with law enforcement and don't even bother to call law enforcement when there is a crime being commissioned, number one. But number two, the depravity, Herman, is what I spoke about on Ivuganazo. And I said, it's all fine and well for us to point a finger at law enforcement and the failure generally of the law to be enforced. But also there's a community there, no one saw that this guy has these sort of issues. I mean, leave aside, his proclivity for goats. But surely there was something sick about this individual, which would have required a community, a church, families to actually say, there's something wrong with so-and-so, let's intervene.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually quite spot on. From what I could deduce from the story, the intention of this young man was to rape an elderly woman. And then when he couldn't gain entry to her house, he proceeded to engage sexually bestiality with a goat, and then the woman reacted to this, I think phoning her son in a different house or something like that, and that is how the matter escalated. And the depravity, I mean, you really can't use another word other than depravity. It is depraved. And it indicates a few broken things in our society. As you point out, it indicates this sort of lost moral fiber of a community to have some sort of influence over people who are clearly losing it in terms of what the community considers its values to be. Now, I'm not in favor of mob governance, but something that we must take into account is this sort of depraved proclivity. This starts from somewhere, and either this person had severe psychological issues or possibly substance abuse. We know of instances of sexual rage triggered by substance abuse, and let's leave the goat aside for one moment. Wanting to rape an elderly woman is, I think, even perhaps more concerning for our society. Sexual crime is massive in this country, and in a way, you can't rely on the state to solve that. This is a moral question. It is a question of basic respect, respect for your own sexuality, respect for your own dignity, respect for the dignity of others. And these aren't values that a state can ever impose. So even not getting yet to the state failure of the police not even being considered a correct response to this incident, I do think it is utterly terrifying that we can have a young man so wayward, so lost, so unaccountable. I say unaccountable deliberately because I don't want him to sound like a victim of society. I don't think that we should jump too easily to that card of saying, oh, there was no one in society. How the true committer of this crime was the community. No. The role of society is to hold to account. And the fact that this man could escape without accountability is an injustice to the community and, of course, a reflection of his depravity. And I do think that we are looking at 100 years of systemic degradation of the dignity of the self. You can't find a job. You can't have a healthy relationship with other sexes. You can't have a healthy relationship with your own sexuality because you just essentially function within a community where the right of people to call you out on your moral failings is now lost. We have lost tradition, and I'm a small c conservative in a personal capacity. I don't believe it's the space scope for the state to step in, but I do think there's a severe lack of social accountability. And I use that example of that guy with a Greek surname who was racist on the beach. It was weeks after when the court process kicked in. By the time already when a bunch of gogos had gotten this guy essentially by the collar and said to him, "What's up with you, man? Stop it." The social community aspect kicked in a way of correcting social behavior long before the state could even wake up in the morning. And I do think that the disintegration of that, and I don't want to go back to apartheid, but the apartheid had a massive, probably the greatest legacy of apartheid is the disintegration of that moral fiber of community. And the ANC has done so little to remedy that. So I just think, it's sick. It's tragic, and I will pray for our country for that.
You and I both in that regard, as I come to wena Koketso, and I think the point that Herman raises is critically important. Insofar as Herman speaks about the community, I also want to whittle it down to the family. Where was this guy's family? Why are we failing as abazali, as parents, to rebuild, inculcate that culture that actually, as family members, you're accountable to us? Aside from you being an individual and really, you have self-ownership, you're responsible for yourself, but there is and should be accountability amongst us as family before we even look to the state, insofar as, what did the state do? Was a failure of law enforcement, blah, blah, blah. Because indeed, Koketso, the next story we're going to look at in a moment speaks to that. And that's what happened in Cape Town with the absolute collapse of law and order, with the illegal taxi owners, pardon me, in that area. But I want you to touch on the issue of the family before I come to you on Cape Town.
Yeah, I fully agree that the family as an institution is actually paramount to social order. In the absence of family, you are actually creating room for chaos to effectively endure. Now, you asked that again, where was the family? Yeah, it's a very good question. Unfortunately, we live in a country, we live in a world where family values have kind of been pushed to the side. And we are now seeing the downstream effects of that. That is rising crime rate, a loss even in the desire to seek out an education. But probably the biggest loss of declining family units overall is how there's no role models on either side of the sexes. Which male role model would actually advise those that come after them that, committing a bestiality is acceptable in any form or fashion? I don't believe there's any. But in the absence of those role models, people do go wayward. And I like what Herman mentioned as well, that, it could also perhaps be the effects of substance abuse, etc., which again comes full circle to a lack of family values, where yet again, there isn't a single parent, I believe, who would advocate for the abuse of substances to their children. So all of these things actually come to fruition in the lack of, social order that was typically handled by the family. And this is also one of the results we see, where people start delegating aspects of their life to the state, and the state doesn't really have a say in terms of what happens in the home. Most of the time, at the very least. And now when you delegate parts of your life to the state, you start actually being a little bit overzealous, including now delegating parts that would have been handled typically by the family unit. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. And I don't think there's really a quick fix to this. It would probably take at least a couple of generations to correct. But let's go back to the family so we can actually start imparting good values from the home and not relying on the state, and more so especially the life orientation class and the good work of NGOs, of course. If we just go back to the family unit, I believe we'd have a much safer society and a much more, I'm looking for the right word here, but a more moral society, where things like bestiality, etc., considered unacceptable, and it doesn't even need a conversation beyond the household.
As I realize I'm muted there, but absolutely, you're correct. And okay, so maybe as I look at time, because I want us to get to our main topic for the evening, let me condense the other two stories that made headlines this week, because they're all linked to an extent. You know, there's a very big focus on crime, safety, and security, and really the failure of the state in that regard. In the headlines I covered this week on Vuganazo, two come to mind, and they're linked in nature. Cape Town saw a violent week of wanton destruction of property, and really the breakdown of law and order from the taxi operators in that part of the world, specifically what's called the cockroach taxis, or amapela, as they self-describe themselves, out in Nyanga. And of course, the taxi operators down further south in Hout Bay, who just decided, heck, with us not getting our way insofar as our interaction with the state, we're just going to embark on a campaign of violence, wanton destruction of property, violence, intimidation, indeed an almost terror-like campaign. I mean, I've flighted images of them burning buses, assaulting bus drivers, doing the same, targeting residents, clinics, and the like. I linked this, Koketso, to the DA then also this week, having a protest march that they took to Pretoria, a hashtag #LMUsGo protest, where they basically point out that link, if you will. Number one, here's the city of Cape Town enforcing the law, because what prompted the behavior of the taxi operators was the city of Cape Town enforcing the law around all taxis must have operating permits. And in retaliation to that, the taxi operators, as I said, embarked on this act of chaos and the like. And even amongst that, even during that rather, the city of Cape Town was saying, you know what, this is the kind of thing that should actually have SAPS respond with much more resources, because they literally hold the lion's share of the law enforcement budget in this country. And the failure of that is the failure of uBhekicele primarily. I wanted to chime in on this because I know we've discussed uBhekicele on the show. I mean, on the show we call him the asshat, but something's got to give at this stage. But is it really enough for hashtag #LMUsGo?
I don't believe it is. I honestly don't believe it is. And there comes that question again of even if you remove Bhekicele from his ministerial position, who then comes in? Do you trust the powers that be to actually make a solid appointment to replace him? Even when his term comes to an end and there's a new president voted into power, etc., do you trust that president, likely to come from the African National Congress, to actually make a solid appointment in that portfolio? You know, what are the list of options from the ANC's benches at the very least, who you could actually honestly say, right, this is a good candidate who would do a good job inside of the police ministry? You know, names are few and far between that I would personally endorse. And again, don't even rely on the corporate media to go out and do some sort of campaign for a particular individual to take up that portfolio from Cele. But I don't believe Cele being removed from that ministerial position is going to solve the problem. I say this because there is no credible, solid replacement waiting in line. Most people don't even know if the police minister has a deputy right now. And then if there is a deputy, again, that raises the question of could, in the absence of Bhekicele, could his immediate subordinate actually take over the mantle? I don't believe so. But at the same time, it is good to see, at the very least, the opposition party doing something about it. I'm not really a fan favorite of marches per se, but it does do a good job in communicating the dissent at the very least. It's good to see the opposition party bringing this to the foreground, but more has to be done. At the end of the day, the power is still going to rest with you and I when we revisit the national ballots at some point in the future. Until we actually vote out the administration that puts people like Bhekicele in power, we'll keep repeating the same old problems and keep wishing for solutions that seemingly never come, not at the very least with this political party in power.
Absolutely. And indeed, Kanthan, I must come to you because I know we've had this conversation before, insofar as, and I think Koketso is right in saying it's a function of just a change of government completely. But there's something to be said here about a DA for me, which is beginning to push out ideas, aside from the banal protests and blah blah blah. One of the ideas they've been pushing out, and indeed one of the individuals who was front and center at that particular protest, was a one Jordan Hill Lewis, the mayor of the city of Cape Town, who's been pushing for a very long time a very federal message of saying, actually, how about you devolve those resources down to me as the mayor of Cape Town? And, I believe in it, I'm speaking in its first person, that as a city, we can do better insofar as marshalling those resources where they're needed to fight crime. And it goes beyond him just talking about this. He cites the intervention of what he calls his LEAP officers, these officers who they've boasted capacity in the townships, the most violent townships indeed. And he's saying, give me the resources.
I think it goes beyond the question of resources, Hitler. And really what it comes down to is the fact that the way in which our constitution is structured right now, we have this absurd situation where policing is a national competence. And so in as much as the DA or whoever happens to be in the local authority want to do their best to prevent crime, until the National Minister of Police is actually deploying appropriate resources down to that province or to that region or to that municipality, things are actually not going to end up happening. And in the case of the Western Cape in particular, this has been a problem going back a couple of decades, really, where consistently the Western Cape has been under-resourced in terms of policing capability. And more importantly, the people who end up getting deployed to the province are not the best equipped to actually deal with the particular idiosyncrasies of that province. Really, what needs to be happening, and this is, a throwback to what we generally refer to as the Mandela effect, where everything was designed on the basis that if Mandela was running the country, everything would actually be fine. We actually need to design our systems to work on the assumption that what if the most incompetent person possible is actually running the show? Will the country still be able to function? That needs to be the starting point of what we're actually doing. And that's why, I completely agree with you that this idea of having marches in Pretoria achieves absolutely nothing. Really at this level, so there's a couple of things that we need to recognize. The one is that the DA government doesn't have the capacity to actually enforce the law. And this is one of those cases where I believe that the DA government actually needs to go beyond the law and to actually enforce the law. And then we go to the courts and actually have the courts turn around and adjudicate on whether we have actually exceeded the bounds of what we have done. And when I say we out here, I don't refer to me, of course. I'm speaking in the third person, putting myself in the position of the DA government of the Western Cape. If we get to that stage, and frankly, what needs to happen is, I used this analogy some years ago in terms of how I would solve the problem of the minibus taxis. I would wait for the minibus taxis to blockade a major freeway. I would come along with an oryx with grappling hooks. I would pick up a random taxi from that blockade, put it out about 100 meters from where the rest of them are put, and fire RPGs into this taxi, blow it to smithereens, and then go on a loudhailer and say, right, who's next? And you'll watch how quickly this stuff actually is solved. Remember that Emerson Mnangagwa, in as much as all of us down here, and especially the DA, they like to throw shade at him all the time. When the taxis up there misbehaved, the first thing he did was to ban all minibus taxis in the country. And when the minibus taxis refused to come to order, he just simply brought in the army and he blitzered them. And now the taxis are actually law-abiding people. He's reintroduced taxis. And guys, you have to understand, I support the rule of law. And the rule of law says that when the minibus taxis get out of hand, go out there and blitzer them. That has to be the case. A PK here, a PK there, and you are sorted.
I feel like this message was brought to you by Leon Schuster. But no, dude, I get you. Don't get me wrong. Even as I make fun of that, and I just saw VUT make the same joke. No, but I mean, the sentiment, Herman, that Kanthan is raising is actually quite a serious one, insofar as somebody has to be the biggest gang, so to speak. It's either the criminals and the criminal elites and the criminally minded, or it's the state whose primary task, of course, is enforcing the law, maintaining law and order, and of course ensuring, insofar as it has a role in protecting our rights, our life, liberty, and property rights, that it is the biggest gang, so to speak. One of those two has to win if we're going to win the war on crime.
I mean, that's a very good way of explaining the legitimate violence function of the state. If you go back to, without making it too philosophical, one of the distinctions that a state, a legitimate government has, compared to other entities that might vie for that idea of governance, of state governance, is the idea of legitimate violence. It is when an entity can act as the biggest gang in the interest of the community more broadly. That's essentially, and the community more broadly considers it to be a legitimate act of violence. And, you know, for large parts of history, when one thinks of that legitimate violence being with, for example, religious entities, the Catholic Church, for large parts of the Middle Ages. And then you also have that sense of legitimate violence morphing into the modern city-state. So my concern comes from a different perspective, is that it seems in South Africa, the South African government has lost its claim to being the exerciser of legitimate violence, because whenever it exercises violence, it is rarely in the interest of a larger communal, constitutional, democratic goal. Rather, it is quite often in defense of the worst actors in society. I think without, you know, making too much of a stretch, Babita Deokaran, who was killed, had no legitimate violence defending her. And you have to start defining two things if you want a state of law and order. Number one, what are the interests which, when under threat, can provoke a state response of legitimate violence? And number two, which entity of the state, or which, you know, branch of the state will be the executor of that legitimate violence? Now, I, on the main, think we have a good constitution. But I do agree with Kanthan that we have design blind spots. And one of those is section 199(1) of the Constitution, which essentially says that there will be one police force in the country. Now, a subsection of that, of 199, I think it's possibly 1995 or 1996, makes the point that other entities, you know, similar to police forces and so on, can be established by national legislation. But I do think it is sort of ironic where you have a situation where you have a decentralized body, the government of Cape Town or the Western Cape, being constitutionally obliged to ask a centralized entity to decentralize. That is asking a turkey to wish for Christmas. And I do think, if nothing else, the idea of Parliament being up for grabs in the next election about 600 days from now, questions like this, perhaps more than anything, can be on the ballot box, because it is an avenue to decentralize police forces. And without being too party political, I do think I understand the reasoning for the march, the DA's march. It's not going to change anything. It isn't. But Leon Schreiber the other day pitched in a parliamentary committee a private member's bill that would make cadre deployment unlawful. A very interesting, useful legislative act that has no purchase on the public imagination whatsoever. So I do think when we are into the area of oppositional politics, your powers and your capacities are so limited that stunts, if we are going to call it that, ultimately becomes one of the very few things you can do that people can point at and say, oh, That's the idea they are pushing. So I don't think strikes in and of themselves accomplish anything. But what I do think this strike accomplished is, here we are talking about it, talking about the merit of the idea of Pele must go. But beyond that, why must he go and what should replace him? Not who, what should replace him. And in that sense, I do sort of get the logic behind it.
Speaking about illogic, it is logical for me to have a keen eye on the time. You're watching us as we pass that 35 minutes or so mark of the show. Remember, we are about a 90-minute show. We might be a bit shorter this evening as we move to the main topic for the evening. Remember, this is Liberty and Friends. We are your premier Sunday evening viewing. Welcome to it. I'm in conversation with Koketso Resane, who is, of course, from the Manpatria podcast, or Kanthan Pillay, analyst, columnist, and someone who I think you should check him out at kanthanpillay.com. There it is on the screen. And, of course, Herman Pretorius, director of the Freedom Advocacy Network. Welcome to it. Good evening. This is Liberty and Friends. A reminder to you that you, dear viewer, are a part of the show. I'll start putting your comments on the screen. And if there are any questions, please also send those forward. As we now transition into the main topic for the evening, guys, I was really hoping I would have our other guest. Wow, I'm really feeling sick. I was really hoping we would have our other guest with us here this evening, Maqhawe Ngubane, who, again, has a very strong command over Zulu history, and especially Zulu history in relation to the topic, which is the Queen and the English monarchy, if you will, and its relation to us as South Africans from the various cultural groupings that each of us, I think, represents here tonight. You know, Koketso, I really chose you for tonight's conversation because you can speak to that dynamic of the Botswana and Motswana, I don't know how that's pronounced, relationship with, you know, a former colonial overlord, which is the English. And of course, Kanthan, you know, the Indian community in this country, literally here because of our colonial past. And of course, Herman, you know, the Afrikaans community and its divergent views within it and its relation, of course, to the crown. So let me begin here. Guys, here's the Queen, 70 years on the throne, Platinum Jubilee recently. And as of really a day or two ago, pardon me, yeah, I'm right, 2 or 3 days ago, pardon me, was still working on you know, quite actively. I mean, one of her last public appearances was her meeting with the newly, and it's newly crowned, but newly elected, if I can call it that, or newly chosen rather, Prime Minister Liz Truss. Herman, the good. I said I'm going to break this conversation up by looking at the good, the bad, and the ugly. One of the good elements of this Queen, of course, is that work ethic and really a stoicism and sureness for over 70 years on that throne.
Absolutely, and I must say, I tweeted out that being able to, in the same week, appoint your 15th prime minister and also, you know, meet your death is something of an indication that she served until the last. And people get very cynical about the British monarchy, and I can see why. It is very, very, very easy to get cynical about the British monarchy. And I'm an unashamed Anglophile, rare for an Afrikaner, and my colleagues always tease me and say only someone who's never been to England can be such a fan of, you know, the Anglo-Western culture or the Anglo-Saxon culture. But if we appreciate that every country in the world confronts the issue of head of statehood, who is the head of state? You've got the head of government, and the head of state is how Edmund Burke traditionally described the functional and the symbolic elements of state. And in South Africa, we have one person representing the head of government and representing the head of state, and that's Ramaphosa. And most republics or countries where that is the case borrows that from the first incident in history where that was the case, and that was, of course, with the American Constitution manifesting the head of the nation and the head of the government in a single person. Now, I happen to think Burke was right in identifying that there are two functions of a state, of government. You've got the symbolic and the functional. And let me give you a few examples of why I think that's right. Nelson Mandela was functionally a rather mediocre president. Eskom's decline started under his watch. He didn't have spectacular domestic policies. Our foreign policy was a bit of a mess under him. So let's give him a 55 or a 50 or a just pass score on the functionality of his government. Yet on the symbolism of what he needed to represent to the country and to the world at that point, he passes with flying colors. What was the question on the world stage and internally at that point? Can South Africa function as a coherent, unified, non-racial nation? And that's a symbolic question, not a policy or a functional question. And on that score, Mandela did really well. It is possible to identify his functional failures and his symbolic successes. The same is the case with Donald Trump, but I would say actually the reverse. He was a pretty good president. For every federal regulation implied in the economy, 2 were repealed. He appointed what I think were very, very good judges to the judiciary of the country. Hispanic and Black unemployment was historically low under Donald Trump. He got Germany to pay up their share of NATO. He actually managed to negotiate or have his government negotiate the Abrahamic Peace Accords. Functionally, he actually did quite well. But the problem is when we come to the symbolism, he couldn't unite his nation. And many people like that about him, willing to take a fight. But you can't fault the fact that Americans could not look to a leader, a person embodying the hopes and aspirations and a point of commonality for them all. So that's a good example of where functional success was complemented by symbolic failure. And in Britain, that role is split in 2. And you've got the functionality of government represented by the prime minister, who can fail and be unpopular and be voted in and out and stir debate. But the symbolism, the loyalty of the individual is never exclusively to the government. There is someone else, a person, an identifiable face who can be everyone's primary loyalty. And I think there's no way of discarding the fact that you need both a head of government and a head of state. And the British system works in that regard. So I think the primary good of Elizabeth's reign was the fact that when the 20th century started, there were more monarchies than democracies in the world. And when the 20th century ended and her reign ended, that had flipped significantly, yet the succession of her son to the throne is completely uncontroversial. The acceptance that Britain will have this continuing symbol is completely uncontroversial. And the power, the intangible, unquantifiable power of being able to not point at a flag, not point at a sheet of music, not point at a coat of arms, but to point at a person and say, I think the country is represented in that individual, and to them, I will be loyal in a patriotic way, I don't think is something as out there as people think. And Elizabeth, up to the very, very last, was immensely active in that role, engaging in more than 600 annual events late into her 90s. You try opening 3 train stations a day and giving 4 speeches. I mean, you tried. Anyhow, that's the rambling entry.
I think you're raising a very important point here that, Kanthan, I want you to chew on as we look at the good. And I want us to be brief on the good, guys, because really, I think there's a lot more meat, if you will, on the bad and the ugly. And again, this is not me before I know what's going to happen in the comment section. Hey, you just want to focus on the bad and blah, 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 blah. No, it's just for the sake of time. And, this is a conversation we'll keep going forward. But, Kanthan, there is something to be said about this old lady insofar as having been born in the 20s, mid-20s, passing away now, the amount of change, Kanthan, this woman has seen. I mean, if one looks at a montage of photos or videos of this woman as queen, as sovereign monarch of that nation, of the realm, as they like to call it, this woman has seen a lot of change, weathered it, but still been a figure of constancy.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But I just want to go back to make a very significant point, which touches on the symbolic role that Herman was talking about. And really the point at which this came to being was at the point at which the Magna Carta was actually drafted, because that was where you had the separation of powers actually taking place for the first time, which is when all of the landowners, all of the barons confronted King John and said, this question of absolute monarchy actually needs to stop at this point, and we need to have a separation of powers. We need to very carefully delineate what you are able to do as king and what the rest of us are able to do in terms of our individual rights, in terms of our property rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as the Americans later on came to define it. And I think that a point that many of my fellow South Africans don't get, which interestingly is not something that is shared with people north of the Limpopo, because people north of the Limpopo are generally more educated than we are here in South Africa. The understanding that the ability of the Queen to actually influence what happens at a political level in the United Kingdom is actually quite constrained. And people don't understand this fundamental issue. So if you look in terms of the powers that the Queen actually has at her disposal, yes, she symbolically appoints the Prime Minister, but actually speaking, doesn't really have the ability to say, no, you cannot be Prime Minister. The Queen does have the ability to say that you are not going to declare war, but again, that can be overridden by an Act of Parliament. So all of these things ensure that the Queen's role, and now the King's role, is really constrained to the type of ceremonial nation-building stuff that Herman was speaking of. And I agree completely that it's entirely important. Now, having said that much, there's a couple of cases that we need to take into account where the ability of the Crown to exercise power over and above what the actual law on the ground is happening at the time, particularly in terms of how it affected us down here in sub-Saharan Africa. Consider, for example, that the reason why Lesotho was not pulled into the Union of South Africa was that it actually became a protectorate of the Crown. And the reason why it became a protectorate of the Crown was the fact that we actually had Mosheshwe, who was, to my mind, the finest diplomat to ever come out of this continent, who, when faced with a military victory over the British, he literally had Cathcart's armies on their knees, and he could have executed all of them. And instead, he faked a symbolic surrender and said, may I not be considered to be an enemy of the Queen, which evoked a state of détente. And at that point, the Crown then granted the status of protectorate to Lesotho, which meant that it was not actually absorbed into the Union of South Africa, apartheid South Africa, as it became subsequently. So these are significant things that people don't understand about the historical context under which the monarchy actually exists in the UK right now. So we need to separate the good and evil of colonialism, and there is good and evil of colonialism, but that needs to be separated from the role that the monarchy actually plays in the world at large, and the role that the Queen herself very specifically has played in terms of actually maintaining the sense of continuity that I think Herman touched on to a large extent. And a lot of those have really revolved around the concept of tradition and around the concept of ensuring that there is continuity across generations of the values that actually define a nation. And frankly, I think that if I look at what happened over the past week, where firstly you had Liz Truss actually becoming Prime Minister, and my goodness, can you think of anyone who is more thick than can potentially be ending up leading the United Kingdom? So you have Liz Truss coming to the fore. You have the pound falling against the US dollar to the lowest level since 1985. And you have the former colony India now overtaking the UK to become the fifth largest economy in the world. And I suspect at this point the Queen said, I've actually done everything that I need to do, and I'm done with this. I'm out of here. And I'd like to think that that was actually what was going through her mind. Now, myself, speaking as a person who is sitting in this country simply because of the fact that colonialism existed, and because of the fact that the British were not able to conquer the Zulus and turn them into labor on the cane fields. And so they were forced to import labor from across the pond, which is where most South Africans of Indian descent ended up coming out here. But, by the same token, if not for that, I would not be sitting here. I would not have my family. I would not have my children. And actually need to understand that all of these things that I hold most dear in my life are a direct product of colonialism. And our ability to actually juggle those things. I think we need to actually wrap our heads around this. Life is full of these contradictions. And I have a deep and abiding respect for everything that the Queen did.
And I want to get into this because I'm just mindful, Kanthan, that you have to leave us in a few minutes. And I do want to get your comments on the bad elements. Remember, I said we're going to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. So maybe, Koketso, as I come to you, just your opening statements on this regard. There is something to be said, Koketso, around a woman who, by the way, her even becoming queen was a sequence of happenstance and really almost even luck to an extent, insofar as she wasn't even meant to be queen. It was effectively the abdicating of her uncle, I suppose, King Edward the Eighth, if I'm not mistaken, which saw then her father.
Seventh.
Was it the seventh? Are we sure, people? I'm pretty sure it's the eighth.
Oh,
there's a hospital named in Durban after him.
What's a number between us? Let's move on.
But in any event, I'm only saying this because I remember this because Durban hospitals are named after the monarchy. And King Edward the Eighth, in particular, he abdicates. Her dad then becomes the successor, or King George the Sixth, another hospital in Durban. But here's the thing. Whether one likes it or not, there's definitely the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're speaking English today. We're part of an international community because at some stage, the realm which she was queen of once was said to govern the world. The sun would never set on it at some stage.
Yeah, look, again, this has probably been said enough times already, but given the events of the past week, you've got political parties and you've got some quite notable individuals trying to piggyback off the manufactured descent for the crown. A lot of the things said this past week were not said a week ago, or even 2 weeks ago, for instance. But just to bring it back, I like everything that Kanthan said around, the Queen specifically, and just her as an individual and her as the reigning monarch for the last 70 odd years. Look, I think we have to acknowledge that, firstly, in her reign, right, she's basically dismantled the works done by all of her predecessors or the recent predecessors in expanding the British Empire. Right, she effectively downgraded it significantly to nothing more than a commonwealth, which pretty much exists to facilitate foreign relations in the absence of something like a world body or individual treaties, etc. So she establishes the post-colonial period commonwealth, which benefits us whether we like to admit it or not. And I was actually telling my girlfriend earlier today that did you know that Mugabe only lost his toys? He only started throwing his toys once he was kicked out of the Commonwealth. By realizing then that that's quite a significant drop in income and you lose a lot of the relationships you would have automatically had through Commonwealth membership. Only then does it actually kick in that, hang on a minute, this is going to cost me here. And in response, he then starts, saying all sorts of things by going after the prime minister at the time, particularly. So the Queen established all of this. She basically kept a thread going between what was elements of the British Empire, which she inherited, let's not forget, Some would then say that she's basically poured water over that Oros juice and diluted it quite a bit. And it takes a lot for someone to actually do that. It takes quite a lot. She does this, of course, knowing that there are risks associated and that it is going to come at significant cost to her country's or her empire's fortune. We don't give her enough credit for that. And just like with Lesotho, if you just go up north from us in Botswana, for instance, Botswana was also a protectorate for, I think, close to 80 years, if I'm not mistaken. It becomes a protectorate, and then she effectively hands them their independence by saying, right, the time for this agreement has come to an end. And even with the protectorate itself, right, people don't know what is the difference between a colony and a protectorate. I believe one of the primary things is that if you're protected, you govern yourself, but we will help you secure your borders. And we will help you at the very least maintain some semblance of law and order. In time, it means we will train your police, etc., but we will maintain a military presence so that you are not open for conquest to your ambitious neighbors. That's exactly what happened with Botswana, So if you go there and you say bad things about the Queen, they'll tell you quite the opposite, because effectively Her Majesty's army protected them from conquest from down south, especially. So these things need to be said. And you can say all you want about the British Empire, but Elizabeth herself did quite a lot by firstly ending the colonialism that her reign inherited, and then secondly maintaining a fabric of relations between all of the former colonies. All of those things require effort, and I'm glad that she did that, and we have benefited from that immensely economically and even through culturally, such as taking value in education, for instance, which didn't exist for the population at large without British influence. I've said enough.
And let me come to Kanthan, because he has to leave in a moment. But Kanthan, maybe as your parting shots then, and I want you to combine those elements. I purposefully put together this panel because it's a Motswana, an Afrikaner, an Indian, and really I'll play the role, not play, but I'm Zulu, so I'll speak on that front. There are definitely deep scars, definitely deep pain, which unfortunately the Queen also was the face of, the bad and the ugly side of it. As your parting shots, Kanthan.
Look, the bad side of it, we could spend hours talking about the atrocities that were perpetrated by the British in India, for starters, and of course the entire concept of concentration camps, Herman is well aware of, actually originated here in South Africa, because it's what the British did to the Boers. It was not invented by the Nazis. But I think, Sihle, the crucial point that I was trying to make is one actually needs to separate the monarchy from the aspects of colonialism that were actually perpetrated by mercantile powers as such. And one needs to actually be able to understand and to separate the way in which those things actually work. So, all of us, for example, in a similar vein, could talk about what goes on in the United States today. And we certainly know that all of the atrocities that have been committed by the United States and continue to be committed by the United States, primarily in the Middle East, but, certainly in North Africa to this day, where, Somalia is constantly being bombed by the United States and no one actually speaks about it. But, we need to recognize a separation between the mercantile powers that are actually driving those agendas and the intrinsic values that are embodied in the system. And the fact of the matter is that the intrinsic values of the United States and of the United Kingdom, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, freedom of speech, property rights, individual rights, all of these things have actually provided a beacon pretty much to the entire planet in terms of the type of society that we need to be framing. It doesn't mean that temporarily lost you guys there for a split second. Are you back? Yeah.
Just finish your thought,
but just one final thing that I'd like to leave us with, guys, is and 7.
Yeah. Kanthan, your line is really deteriorated. I'm going to remove you for a moment, and then just give me a thumbs up, Kanthan, when your line is sorted. But Herman, there's a particular point Kanthan was making around the need to separate the two, perhaps. I don't know what your view is on that particular notion, but there is definitely a bad that one can bring up insofar as how, let's say, Afrikaners might view, the crown and really its role here in Southern Africa.
Yeah, no, I must say the fascinating thing is that both my parents were subjects of Queen Elizabeth, because they were both born before 1961, the 31st of May 1961, when we became a republic in South Africa. So both of my parents were born as subjects of the British monarch. My father was old enough to be born as a subject of Elizabeth's father, in fact. And I think if we're going to go from the good to the bad, and then one sort of has to see bad, I think, within the context of this evening's discussion, very much in the history of the crown, and perhaps the history of Queen Elizabeth specifically, is that in 1999, with the centenary celebrations of the Anglo-Boer War, which broke out in 1899 and lasted until 1902, there was a banquet in South Africa with the Queen in attendance, and she acknowledged the suffering, and she faced demands from South Africans at a meeting of the heads of the Commonwealth to apologize for Britain's role in the Anglo-Boer War and for agitating that. And this isn't an unprecedented demand, nor the apology expected or demanded unprecedented. The Prince Charles, in the last few years at a meeting of the Commonwealth heads of government, also expressed and apologized about the brutality of the Atlantic slave trade, in which Britain participated, and, worth mentioning, became the first prominent empire in the history of the world to make slave trading illegal, and also to use their own military resources to enforce that illegality. So that is, I think, something that must be noted in that sense, that this demand of an apology wasn't unprecedented, nor was the apology. And yet the Queen did not apologize. Now, I'm not one who sets great store by any such historic apologies. I don't think... I think you are individually responsible for what you individually did. I mean, accountability, the rule of law, it all works on an individual level. The Queen wasn't born when this war broke out. I wasn't born when this war broke out. So the Queen apologizing to me would be apologizing on behalf of something she didn't do to something that it hadn't happened, to someone that it didn't happen with. But as far as that goes, she did not apologize when, a few years later, 12 years later, in 2011, she did apologize to the Irish for the role that British colonialism played in struggling there. So if there's good and bad, I think one of the bads was the inconsistency with which she dealt with the legacy of her forebears and of colonialism. But as I say, it's not something I set massive store by. And I do think we need to get serious here also about the fact that the point of the crown in a constitutional democracy, increasingly from 1688, the glorious revolution there, was to be a figurehead and to be the symbol under which Parliament acted. And the glorious revolution of 1688 is important because it was there when King William of Orange actually, and his wife, committed to be co-monarchs of the British Empire at the time, subject to the will of Parliament. They pledged, the first time in history that a king and a queen pledged their loyalty to Parliament rather than just expressly the other way around. So part of the Queen's individuality, or part of the Queen's purpose, was to be a symbol, and therefore to be, to a very large extent, powerless, and the very little power she had was in terms of soft power. So I think the good, she kept this symbol respected through very, very difficult times. She created a voluntary family of nations from former conquered peoples, a community so popular that countries that were never colonized by the British, like Rwanda and Namibia, asked to be part of the Commonwealth of Nations. So I think those are definitely good stuff. The bad is that she dealt with the legacy of the colony and the crown, of the colonial era and the crown, inconsistently. And then if we have to look at the bad, I do think that we need to look at the inhumanity that monarchy foists upon the head that bears the crown. And you mentioned it, Sihle, that Edward VIII abdicated because he listened to the man downstairs rather than the man upstairs, and chose Wallace Simpson over his duty to country. And that forced forward Bertie, anyone who's seen The King's Speech, go watch it, heartwarming film, Elizabeth's father onto the throne, which essentially killed him at the age of 56, making her monarch at the age of 24, 25. The ugly, you can't get away from the fact that she was a woman that wanted to love other things, do other things, enjoy other things, and then had to spend 70 years in denial of the self. And I do think that that is a noble thing, but I certainly think that it is one of the ugliest points of the monarchy, is it is a denial of someone and the denial of the individuality of someone, which is something I quite often find very, very difficult to stomach.
Testing 1, 2. Sorry. No, I think that's a good overview here. But I want us to be a little bit more controversial here, guys, because I get that we're trying to be respectful, given the Brits are literally in mourning on this issue. But I've seen a lot of anger on social media by people who, and again, I'm not saying I'm indulging it, I'm just relaying it for the purpose of our conversation in the last sort of 10 minutes that we have. I've seen a lot of anger on social media by people who've appropriated, if you will, the events of the past, the events of what their ancestry went through, to then foist that onto this queen and basically say, why does she keep quiet on this issue or the other, right? Let me speak in relation to some of the chat I saw amongst the groupings of Zulu influencers on social media, who now suddenly began calling for all sorts of things to be repatriated, insofar as we lost them as Zulus when we were conquered by the English. Now, even as I say this, there's three broad areas here. They'll always look at the individual, or an individual in history's past who was aggrieved. They'll look at the nation, and they'll look at things, right? So on the issue of individuals, they'll cite, for example, King Pretorius, who, upon the loss of the Zulus to the English crown, endured the humiliation of the breakup of the Zulu Empire. And I use the word empire on purpose because we, much like the English, were an expansionist lot. We were conquering other groupings in order to create a nation, if you will, an empire, if you will. And we were eventually defeated by the English. And the humiliation, therefore, of initially the king, Pretorius, the loss of territories, and of course, the breakup of the peoples. Those three elements that I spoke of: individual, in this case, the king, a nation state, or the dismantling of it in our case, and of course, the third one, the insofar as people are calling for reparations, the then perceived taking away of something, whether it's artifacts or land or whatever the case may be. It's those three things that, if you look at criticism of the Queen from all over, from the Irish to Americans to us, it's always revolved around those three things, that this Queen said nothing about that. Koketso.
Well, I'd like to know what was actually supposed to happen according to all these voices of dissent, actually. We've seen already in the past that whatever you do, if you're ever in that position, whatever you do is never good enough. and the queen knew that. In her wisdom, right? I think she was very selective, of course, in what she spoke out against and what she spoke about. But like I mentioned, what was she supposed to do actually? You can't satisfy a bloodthirsty mob, for lack of a better word. But I like how you mentioned there that it's not just with the Zulu Empire, if we can call it that. That they were very expansionist, etc. The same is true of my people. The Botswana also conquered and expanded territory. And again, when I say Botswana, I'm talking about a collection of disparate groups here. We did terrible things to the firstly the Kalanga, the Bakalaga as well. We did many terrible things to them, and so why is it always acceptable when the Africans do to each other what the colonialists did to them? People don't want to speak about that. And those same voices of dissent, that would be my first question to them then, to say, right, you want the queen to speak out about ABC, but you are unwilling to have the very same conversation regarding that which the queen did to you and you having done it to someone else. No one wants to speak about that. Instead, what we are then told is we are sold this ideal that Africa was this grand utopia of many tribes singing together, sharing song and dance and holding hands and singing a vernacular version of Kumbaya. While at the same time, singing "We Are the World," including that remix with all the different stars. But no one wants to talk about that. The vision we are told is that before the colonialists got here, they found a very peaceful land, which actually contradicts that stereotype of an African warrior. How do you become a warrior? You don't become a warrior, the strong, fierce, dominant warrior, by sitting at home and knitting. You become that strong warrior by conquest, by war, by battle after battle, by being hardened men. That's the reality that the...
If I might say something on that point, it is an incredibly recent development that countries do not have the right to military conquer. If you look at the sum total of human history, and let's say we can safely track it 6,000 years, I don't think that idea is even a century old. That countries with military superiority cannot conquer other countries. I would venture that was first put forward with the League of Nations after the First World War. Where did the League of Nations come from? It was the brainchild of Jan Smuts. Why was it the brainchild of Jan Smuts? Because Jan Smuts was a prominent politician and leader in a colony, a country conquered by the United Kingdom, what would become the United Kingdom, the British Empire at the time. The very notion that a country does not have the right to militarily conquer and expand its own territory is a product of British colonial legacy. So you cannot indulge the favor of saying it was morally wrong for you to conquer us without standing under the shade of the colonial tree that you are trying to chop down. Now, I can't actually talk up British imperialism. I think it was defective and it was demeaning and it was insulting. But neither can I then turn around and use that very legacy to criticize the legacy in the first place. So that's, I think, a philosophical short circuit in the brains of many of the screeching critics that just do not understand that humanity it's not a young adult novel. You don't get to pick a good guy falling in love with a damsel in distress and then live happily ever after. It's a messy business. Good ideas come from bad people, and some good people have awful ideas. But the fact of the matter is you have to judge history intelligently. And part of that, one of the topics I've seen most tweeted on about, is the Cullinan Diamond. It should be given back.
Yeah.
Well, these people just don't know their history. The Cullinan diamond was discovered in 1905 at the Cullinan mine, and for 2 years, despite receiving mega press around the world, couldn't find a buyer. It was then the Transvaal government of Louis Botha that bought the diamond on behalf of the Transvaal government and gave it to Edward VII as a gift. So you can go on about colonial plundering, but the Cullinan diamond, ladies and gentlemen, is not it. It is an example of a nation conquered in war, respecting a new sovereign 5 years after the end of the conquering war. So let's get serious here. Let's be adults. If you want anyone to apologize for colonialism, number one, realize that you are essentially a child with a crayon on the stage of human history, shouting that you want nap time. The second thing is that nap time was the product of the very treatment you are seeking to despise. And I must say, we can paint everything with such bright and kind colors these days until we get to the point that history is the tracking of blood and power. And if you want to get away from that, well, the young adult section in exclusive books, I hear, is pretty good.
Well, let me add to this, because for me, I think we've touched on something here, guys, that I think requires a little bit of attention. Why is it, if you look at a lot of the chatter online, and I echo some of the sentiments here, but I do think there is a case to be made that perhaps the Queen, and I actually get your point, Koketso, now that I validate my own statements, but let me make what I was about to say let me say what I was about to say, pardon me. I do get the sentiment when people say, you know what, here's a queen who, being at the helm of the monarchy during a time of so much change, where she weathered a lot of that change, and indeed maybe even moved with it, so to speak, adapted the monarchy to it, but at the same time held to a core set of traditions. Here's where I don't get things slightly. I don't get how there's an expectation that I must hold her to a higher standard than the standard I'm willing to hold myself, or a standard which I reject others holding me to. Let me be precise and specific. As a Zulu in particular, if I were to be held to the standard that I'm expecting the English to be held to, lo and behold, what I would have people say about me and my king, for example, isiZulu, Kazwelithini, insofar as there are clans today who are bathed in the blood of, let's say, the expansionist behaviors of previous kings, of previous Zulu kings, and who even to this day, by the way, are still demanding reparations or, let's say, a breakaway from the Zulu nation, hapati hapata. I can go down the line insofar as what they're demanding. I never hear the same vehemence in saying, actually, let's recognize the claim that is made by, let's say, the as I forget now this particular clan, just south of
the Basotho.
Or the Basotho is one, actually. That's a more readily available one. Let me use that, the Basotho. The one I wanted to go for was a grouping who didn't even get their own kingdom, for example, and still to this day are demanding their own kingdom. Let me use a more readily accessible one. I was about to say the Khoi and the San.
Oh, okay.
Who, if even by Zulu history, by Zulu oral, the Ngubane, thank you, Andre. The Ngubane is who I was trying to look for. But let me stick to the example of the Khoi and the San. The Khoi and the San can tell you stories about how they were treated and chased off their ancestral lands here in KwaZulu-Natal, modern-day KwaZulu-Natal. And beyond that, they can even tell you, and even Zulu history echoes the atrocities we committed against them. I don't get how I must be absolved from that responsibility as a modern-day Zulu, but still expect to hold the Queen of England and now the King of England to that same standard. That's the one thing I was going to ask, for example, Maqhawe and Ngubane, who was going to join us tonight, because I think it's one of those conversations that we need to have as modern-day Zulus. Let me come to you, Koketso, and then Herman. the double standards.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, yeah, it's an example I like to bring up at every opportunity, I guess, more so around this time, given the recent events. But it's exactly that. Why is it then that, especially in the realm of debate, right? People want to, I don't even want to say argue, but people want to bicker from a position of ignorance, really. And this is the kind of pattern you find from those who are proponents of things like reparations. And I must say, I was quite disappointed when the president was making those calls to Europe to start having the conversation about reparations. I find it to be lazy, I find it to be it is a blunt knife in the toolbox of the lazy. They don't want to interrogate their own role in some of the atrocities that has happened in the past. What about those families who have become victims, for instance, of I'm struggling to find the words here, but what about the families of the victims of those who have found themselves on the correct side of history, if we can put it like that, on the victim side of history, who unfortunately then go out and, in defiance, of course, have actually caused harm to the apparent agents of the colonial masters. When you have issues with a regime, the worst thing you can do is actually boil it down to something as basic as race, because what you're effectively doing at that point in time is saying that, right, because your king happens to be English or Zulu, for example, I'm going to hold an entire people accountable for the actions of their king. That is, you are assigning blame to people who are nowhere near the room when these decisions were made to actually cause you harm and to come in effectively ruin your and your people's lives. And I have a very similar view with the whole Russia-Ukraine war as well. Why is it that the average Russian must find themselves punished for events that they have absolutely no control over? But I digress. That's exactly it, that we need to actually look back and actually adopt principles, rather, because principles don't change irrespective of who the leader is and what the time of or what the era is, rather. Hang on to the principle, and only when you do that will you then realize that, hang on a minute, perhaps there are other conversations to be had, that the principle was broken on both sides of the spectrum. But people don't want to do that. They want to rather prescribe a standard to someone else that they don't even want to entertain for themselves. You want to ask reparations of someone else, but you're unwilling to have the reparation conversation with those you've harmed yourself, both now and in the past. It's hypocrisy at best, but probably a unique form of arrogance at the worst case. And we're seeing this coming to the surface given the recent events.
Sorry, as I'm just okay, I'm on. Sorry. No, look, I think for me, as we close off this conversation, Herman, and I want to give you your final say, Herman. For me, that contradiction is an entertaining one, because I often see people really do they run the mental gymnastics of not wanting to be held by the same standard they're insisting the English must be held to. There's almost even, Koketso said it, a victimology behind it, of suggesting because I'm history's victim, I should not be held to a standard, even though I myself may have acted in the exact same way. Sorry, I was stuttering early on because I was really trying to find this particular clan, because I think it's going to play out as we go forward with the transition from the old Zulu king to the new Zulu king. There will be voices here in KwaZulu who actually say, hang on, we've actually never wanted to be a part of the Zulu nation. We were our own clan and we were forced into this thing by a colonial overlord, i.e. the Zulus. They won't be talking about the English when they talk about a colonial overlord. They'll be talking about Zulus. So anyway, your final take on this as we wrap up, Herman.
I think, and this is going to sound a bit left field, but bear with me here. one of the most prominent figures in Afrikaner history is General Christian de Wet, who was an absolute hero of the Anglo-Boer War, very much considered the Boer Napoleon. He was a brilliant strategist in the formal first part of the war, when there was, it was traditional warfare where one force would meet another and there would be a direct conflict. But he was always also essentially the father of guerrilla war in the latter part of the Anglo-Boer War, where the warfare developed of being enough of a nuisance to undermine your opponent's ability to have the supplies, the men, and so on necessary to wage war. So de Wet is an absolute legend. He was a politician before and after the war. And he dies in, I think, 1920, and is to this day still probably one of the most important Afrikaners in our history. Even if 15 years ago, there was the song about, De La Rey, De La Rey. Now, de Wet was De La Rey. Before that, we had the song de Wet. He really is this legend. He had a brother called General Piet de Wet. And Piet de Wet and Christian de Wet are both men who you should see within the context of their times. The Afrikaner considered the people who fought in the Anglo-Boer War to fall in three categories: the bitter einders, people who fought to the very bitter end; the henzoppers, the people who stopped fighting in the middle of the war; and then the joiners, who would actively stop fighting on Boer side and start fighting on British side. Piet de Wet, in contrast to his brother who became this Boer hero, Piet de Wet was first a henzopper and later became a joiner. Now, they were both right. Piet de Wet understood earlier than most Boers that this small collection of Boers in two republics on Africa could not defeat the British Empire. He was correct in coming to the conclusion that the best way towards peace, towards the survival of his people, would be surrender. Yet his brother was also right, that it is worth fighting a war for what you have. What I'm trying to make with this point is that you can't judge history by the lazy morality of your armchair. These two brothers manifest the two extremes that, to a very recent degree, manifest and define the sense of Afrikaner honor. Did your ancestors fight in the war to the very end, or did they stop fighting, or did they join the other side? And yet you can make a morally sound case for both of those brothers making the right choice, choosing peace when oblivion and annihilation is the necessary end of war, and choosing war because you are defending the justice of self-determination. The same morality that defined the difficulty of this brotherly relationship must inform us when we look at history, when we look at Queen Elizabeth, when we look at the crown, when we look at her father, when we look at the 20th century and her role within it. History is not a cheap series where you can identify the good guy and the bad guy. And the moment you start doing that, you get cheap and stupid shots against a dead lady of 96, thinking yourself somehow fulfilled for insulting her for something that she should have said or did differently a century before her birth. So I would leave you with that. Appreciate that morality is good, that justice is good, that freedom is good, and that within your own time, hold yourself to the highest standards. But then look at history with morality, not as the foreground, but as the conclusion of your thoughts. Don't enter history with the complexity, without the complexity of someone like Piet de Wet and Christian de Wet, in their own ways being right, and perhaps in their own ways being heroes. And I think in the shrill conversation that followed the death of Queen Elizabeth, that has too easily been forgotten.
No, I definitely take that point, pardon me. Koketso, I'm going to give you your final say. And even as you do, I really want us to grapple with this because it's an open-ended question for me, and one which I hope will continue in the comment section insofar as there will, of course, be the people who are like, rah, 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 the Queen this, the English that, and blah, blah, blah. And they're well within their rights to do that. But then there'll be others who say, look, as Herman said, history is very nuanced in its nature. And as I also try to frame this conversation tonight, there'll be the good, the bad, and the ugly. Your final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, yeah, again, I don't want to sound too cold when I say this, but the reality is that, yeah, the Queen took her last breath and the sun rose again the following day. So my world certainly is not going to come to a standstill because Elizabeth, because the Queen Elizabeth II is no more. Neither will the entire kingdom she leaves behind, whether they approve of her reign or not, whether you approve of a monarchy or not, the sun rose again. So go back to the important aspects of your life. Look at today's problems and how you can make tomorrow better than today was. As for those who are really not interested or who want to dismantle the monarchy at all costs, what do you gain out of it? Honestly, what do you gain out of it? Then the monarchy is no more and your problems are still there, probably even more pronounced than they are. You solve no problem by dedicating your entire spectrum of attention to the happenings of the Windsor family at the very least. So the sun rose again. Leave it as it is and continue trying to make a better life for you and your family. It's no point really bickering about the relevance of, the British monarchy or not. It's really pointless. And again, people like to overemphasize this. This is not the only monarchy that exists in the world, let alone in Europe either. So let those who are her subjects worry about it. You on this side of the world have other issues. You've got bigger problems to deal with right now, and you still need to make plans regarding the next bout of load shedding, which is coming probably sooner than you think.
Well, maybe that's one thing we now have in common with the English, because they're going to be facing load shedding too. Hello, England. Welcome to the reality of what it's been like to be a South African.
Zisha, can I quickly ask a question? Has he ever considered ending a mic drop speech like that, appropriating the language of load shedding by just sort of going blackout?
Yeah, I'm gonna need to rehearse that one.
with the little electric slide there, Herman, symbolic of how we like that very electricity. Guys, this will be my 2 cents on this, really, as I conclude. I mean, I totally understand the sentiments as has been raised by various, let's say, Zulu social media influencers. Indeed, one of those exchanges was between me and who was meant to be our guest tonight, where, he basically said, oh, and I'm going to paraphrase that, we remember the infiltration of the British Empire at the Zulu royal house, he says. May the spirits of those who fell at isiZulu continue to haunt Elizabeth in her death and all her subjects in flesh. May the Zulu nation be one day freed from the shackles of colonialism. That was actually the comment that was made by Ushumi Lenkezo Ngubane, that's Maqhawe Ngubane, who I really wanted, pardon me, to actually come onto the show tonight, because I do get that anger. There is that anger that's been pervasive. However, my response to him is where I want to end. And I said, really, nothing will raise. Let me try and put this on screen. Sorry, it'll just make it a little easier. Bear with me, guys. This will take a second. No, not video file. Close that. Open this. And even as I'm saying that, do me a favor, dear viewer, and hit the like button, please. We're in the last 2 minutes, really, of the show. There it is. I don't know if it's legible.
Zoom in for us, please.
Yeah, I was about to say, give me 2 seconds here. That should be slightly better. There we go. yeah, as I said, Maqhawe, who was going to join us tonight, said, he remembered the infiltration of the British Empire at the Zulu royal house. May the spirits of those who fell at Isangwana, that's a great battle that happened between the Zulus and the English, where the Zulus prevailed, continue to haunt Elizabeth in her death and all her subjects in the flesh. May the Zulu, pardon me, goodness me, I just lost that tweet. There we go. May the Zulu nation be one day freed from the shackles of colonialism. I then responded, and I think this is where I want to end this evening, that actually nothing will erase that. Nothing will erase the sting, if you will, of being conquered. What we as AmaZulu did to others, that is conquer, the English did to us. However, one cannot hold a grudge forever, especially as doing so would make us the lesser people, and we sure as hell are not. And that's exactly where I want to end this show, in reminding us all that actually, at some stage, one can live in the past and be the victim of what they've gone through, or one can live in the now, look to the future, and be a victor insofar as choosing what you want to do, choosing how you want to exercise your decisions, make your choices, and of course, and what you can build for your people. And I think Zulus at the moment are in that trajectory. We're in that frame of mind. When I look at the new energy around our now king, Mrs. Zulu Ka Zwelithini, a definite energy of building, rebuilding, and looking to the future, which is why I think, as a final gasp, that Zulu showed their class by, even as other groupings around the world were slandering the Queen and using that moment for clout on social media, the press release that was issued by the Office of the King, absolutely classy, insofar as saying we recognize the mourning and we recognize the loss and we recognize our history as Zulus and the English, and that this is a great loss for the English. So it's that ethos that I think I want to end tonight's show on. Herman, as we close things, how do the people find you on your social media, and how do we get in touch with Fan? What are you guys up to?
Yes, so you can find me at @manierman on Twitter if you want. If you are so sadomasochistically inclined. Otherwise, you can find Fan at Badger of Liberty on Twitter and on Facebook. Catch the wonderful podcast, the short form pieces, the quote cards we see doing really, really well, and also check out our explainer videos. It's about getting the message of freedom to people who really can enjoy it at a very, very basic level. It's not about high school debating. It's about trying to tell people that what they're thinking, what they're feeling, they're not the only ones doing that.
Absolutely. And we'll be in touch as the BDL show with the guys at Fan. There's a few nice ideas I want us to pull off. But with that being said, please check out the Freedom Advocacy Network, guys, including their social media and their YouTube page. Please make sure you go over there and subscribe, will you? Koketso Prutwami, how do the folks find you on social media? And what was on Manpatria this weekend?
Yeah, so if you want to find me on social media, I have one of those private Facebook accounts, I think. But yeah, hit me up on Twitter. That's Koketso Resane. Yes, I use my real name, my real surname, and a real photo of me. Unlike certain aspects of social media, of course, I am who I am. Shout out to La Solis there. Yeah, shout out to La Solis who's posted the link there. So for those who don't know, Manpatria, we've effectively moved everything to the Manpatria website. So if you want to watch all of our content, all of it is inside of the website. If you want to really see the really old stuff, become a Manpatria citizen and contribute on Patreon, of course. But yeah, you can check out the episode we recorded yesterday. That was between myself and Dumo. We didn't really touch much about the Queen's death, but we did speak at length about the obsession certain aspects of social media have with cancel culture, and really just arguing with us and taking screenshots. And they've part of their list of hobbies is trying to basically dunk on us somehow while we at work, some of us at the least. So yeah, just have a look at that as well. And the week before that, of course, was Duma with Nzuzo talking about a lot of the legal implications of some of the recent court cases. So yeah, it's just three ordinary guys talking about ordinary things and keeping it real. Manpatria.com.
Absolutely. And on that glorious note, let me say goodbye to both of my guests and say goodbye to you, dear viewer. Thank you so much for watching the show. I don't know what your views were on this one, guys. And in that regard, I invite you to share your views. Comment, please, whether you're watching the simulcast on Facebook, YouTube, or on Twitter. I definitely do take about 10 or 15 minutes after the show, to go through the comments. Just a quick reminder, do not miss the Big Daddy Liberty show this Wednesday. It will be a banger. You remember that conversation I had with Times Live journalist Aaron? I'm now forgetting his surname. My apologies to you, Aaron. But they've exposed the Zama Zama network and have provided harrowing details as to how, goodness me, let me leave it at this, how the South African mining sector has effectively collapsed in this country and is now in the hands of a terror-like international grouping who are literally terrorizing towns across the country. So that expose, we'll have it here on the Big Daddy Liberty show on Wednesday at 7:30, where you'll get to meet the press who wrote that story. Do not miss it. Trust you me, you do not want to miss this one. With that being said, thank you guys for watching tonight's show. Find me on my website. That's www.bigdaddyliberty.com. And of course, guys, consider making a contribution to the show. As little as 100 Rand a month goes a long way to helping me realize a dream I have, which is to not only have editors on the show to produce content, but also to actually begin to hire journalists who can create stories almost carte blanche style. That's where we're heading here at the Big Daddy Liberty show. And indeed, we'll have some content for you very, very soon. With that being said, thanks for watching. And a reminder, as I always do at the end of every show, never trust a commie.